The second side piece to testify was Malika Martin, whose nickname was Kaya. Miss Martin had been involved in an on-again, off-again relationship with Reco for years. She said that at around 6 a.m. on August the 13th, this would be 4 hours before Erica Bellamy arrived at Yolanda's house to pick up her children, Reco showed up on her doorstep in a panic, talking fast and asking to be let in. She said his shoes were bloody and that there was dried blood on the side of his face. She asked Jones what was going on, and he said that during an argument, Yolanda had attacked him, and he had, quote, cut the fuck, unquote, out of Yolanda. When Martin asked, what about the kids? Jones stated that he had to kill them because they had seen everything. She let him into the house, and he took a shower. She said that at that point, she was afraid of Jones. Martin said she swiped a pair of sweats from her father's laundry basket and gave them to Reco to wear. Around 6:30 a.m., they both got into Martin's car and went to another one of his girlfriend's houses. These two women had been bitter rivals for Reco's affection. They couldn't get together and decide to just both leave Reco Jones alone, but they had no problem getting together to tamper with evidence. For me, this whole scenario is just surreal. Someone shows up at your house at 6 in the morning, all bloody, confessing to multiple murders, and you offer them a shower and your father's clothes? This is why we don't answer our doors anymore. So she goes with Reco over to a third side chick's house, a woman named Tamika Terrell. And she was even thirstier than Malika because she continued to write Reco Jones in prison for years. Terrell testified that when Jones and Martin showed up at her place, Jones told her that he had eliminated Yolanda, that he had cut the fuck out of her and the children too. He asked if he could wash his bloody clothes in Terrell's washing machine. But Terrell had no washing machine, so they burned his pants, shirt, and socks in a metal garbage can. Everything except his shoes, a pair of Rockports. The three of them then got into Martin's car and went back to the crime scene. While Reco sat in the car, they wiped some blood off the door and rubbed the doorknob down to remove any fingerprints Reco might have left. These idiots had just become accessories after the fact to a quintuple homicide, the savage murders of 4 children and a young woman. I don't understand why Malika didn't call 911 while Jones was in the shower. I don't know why Terrell didn't rush back into her house, lock the door, and call 911 instead of getting into the car with Martin and Jones. Reco's girlfriend's testimony gave us some real insight into Jones's state of mind on the night of the murders. The only thing he was worried about was cleaning up the crime scene. He was practically hysterical when he got to Malika's house, but it wasn't because he was overcome with remorse over what he had just done. Everything that I've learned about Reco Jones suggests a very weak and petty man that used women to solve his problems. He hid behind his mother the night that Yolanda came by the house instead of just giving her back her stuff. He hid behind the girlfriend that didn't want her name published. All that nonsense about Yolanda Bellamy threatening her and her family was clearly an attempt to goad the two women into a fight. He hid behind Martin and Terrell, using them to do his cleanup work. Now, the two women were able to tell the jury what had happened outside the house on the night of the murders, but it was the coroner and blood spatter analyst Kathy Carr who had the grisly task of explaining to the jury what had transpired inside. They said that Reco Jones must have arrived at Yolanda's house at around 3 a.m. on August the 13th. There was no evidence of forced entry, so it is believed that she let him in. The assault began with Reco stabbing Yolanda in the neck. She was holding Nate III at the time, and the knife passed through the baby's hand into his mother's flesh. Nate III fell to the floor. Yolanda was punched in the face and head, leaving her with contusions and a busted lip. Her throat was cut in 3 long gaping gashes that completely severed her jugular vein. The blood spatter evidence showed that Nathan Jr., the 5-year-old, had been cut and was bleeding and still somehow managed to get to the front door. He had tried to open the door, but the deadbolt was engaged, and at 5 years old, he didn't have the strength or dexterity to twist the top lock. Instead, the terrified boy ran upstairs to try to hide. He only made it up a few steps before he was dragged down the staircase. His body was lying face up at his mother's feet. 3-year-old Shafante and 5-year-old Delvante were both killed in their sleeping bags. Nathan III died next to his mother. All of the children suffered at least 7 stab wounds and 4 slash injuries to the neck and upper chest. They also had multiple superficial cuts to their heads and faces. The medical examiner testified that all of those injuries were inflicted while they were conscious, and though they could not have caused death, they had certainly caused pain. This is in regards to the superficial cuts. All of the children's eyes were wide open. I don't know whether she had actually told Reco that she was pregnant or whether he was just making excuses to justify what he had done, but the autopsy showed that she wasn't. This testimony was just ghastly. Reporters working the trial described how horrified the jurors were, how anguished they were from looking at the photos of the children. They were wiping away tears and glaring at Jones. The prosecutor said that he could only bring himself to display 2 photographs of the children for the jury throughout the entire trial. Rico's lawyer had actually argued that no photos at all should be shown, that they should just rely on the medical examiner's notes and hand-drawn diagrams. Kathy Carr testified that Jones's blood was found inside the house. There was a spot of blood on the kitchen counter that was so diluted with water that it was pinkish instead of red. At first, investigators didn't think it had any real evidentiary value. But when the stain dried, it turned into a kind of oddly shaped ring with a red crusty outline. That dried blood was a mixture of all 5 victims' blood plus some of Reco Jones's blood. Jones must have washed his hands in the sink after the murders. A mixture of the victim's blood was also found on one of the shoes that Jones was wearing at the time of his arrest, the Rockports that they had neglected to burn. Next, Detective Monica Childs took the stand and relayed the conversations and events from her hours-long interview with Jones. Her cross-examination by the defense was centered on whether or not Childs had threatened Jones or coerced him into admitting involvement. Jones was represented by John McWilliams. This was McWilliams's first murder case, and he didn't have much to work with. He actually had wanted to call one of Jones's ex-girlfriends, the one he assaulted and was jailed for shortly after meeting Yolanda. He wanted to call her to say that although Jones had beaten her mercilessly, he hadn't killed her. And so this should prove that Jones isn't the type of person who could have committed these murders. Yeah. The judge said she wasn't trying to tell him how to run his case, but she couldn't see any benefit to having the young woman testify, so she was never called to the stand. When we criticize defense attorneys, we mustn't forget that the client has a lot of say about how the matter proceeds. If the client gives his lawyer some BS story and wants to stick to it, that lawyer has to get up in court and tell it to the jury with a straight face. If the client wants a witness called, the lawyer has to do his best to make that happen. McWilliams had a devil of a time representing Reco. He argued with his lawyer and accused him of colluding with the prosecutor. Twice during the trial, Judge Kim Worthy had to send the jury out and explain to Jones that he couldn't just speak out when he wanted, and that he could only speak in court in response to a question. She also had to remind him twice that his lawyer was there to help him. Reco Jones testified at his trial, which is something that trial watchers always want to see. Jones's testimony was truly a spectacle. He said that on the night of the murders, Malika Martin had confronted him about the way he kept bouncing back and forth between Yolanda and her. Jones said that he and Martin went over to Yolanda's house so they could straighten the love triangle situation out once and for all, because that's what you do at 3 a.m. You gather up all your side pieces for a powwow at a house where 4 children are sleeping. Jones said that Martin and Yolanda started arguing. Suddenly, Malika pulls out a knife and starts stabbing Yolanda. Reco said he was incredibly frightened, and as Martin began the assault on Nathan III, he bolted from the house, running for his life.